Now, the dangers facing journalists around the world remain high. That's according to new figures. The press freedom body Reporters Without Borders says that just over 70 journalists were killed in 2013 whilst simply doing their job. Kidnapping increased by a staggering 129%. Well, in a moment we'll be talking to one BBC reporter who's had his first-hand experiences of working in the most dangerous parts of the world, and a representative from the organisation who put the report together. First, a summary of the figures. Very salutary reading. Well, joining me from Paris is Lucie Morillon, Head of Research and Advocacy at Reporters Without Borders, and from Beirut, Paul Wood, who's the BBC's Middle East correspondent. And Paul, let me come to you first of all. You have been going to very dangerous places for a very long time. Do you feel that the dangers of being a reporter in a conflict zone have grown?
Well, every war is different, and I remember back in Bosnia people were talking about, well, reporters are being targeted now because they're not seen as neutral, they're seen as advocating for one side or another. A lot of people who've been around a good deal longer than me say that Syria is the most difficult and dangerous conflict they have done. I think now if you get into trouble in Syria, and I know of almost no foreign journalists in opposition-held areas of Syria at the moment, but if you do get into trouble, nobody's coming to help. And you may be held by a criminal group, you may be held by a jihadi group. We believe there are 20 to 30 journalists in captivity. Most of those are not publicly acknowledged, but really you're on your own, and that is a very difficult situation to be in, and it's why we're seeing very little, if any, independent news coming out of rebel-held areas of Syria.
And Paul, we showed in the introduction just, you in Syria. I mean, presumably judgments are being made by news organisations that much as we would love to be there, it's just too dangerous to go.
That clip, I think, was from November of 2011, when the danger really was of being arrested by the regime, and activists and rebel fighters would take a great deal of care of visiting journalists to try to keep them out of regime hands. Now, frankly, a lot of the rebel groups who are looking after you have become criminalised. They have turned to looting, they've turned to kidnapping their own people. It's very difficult to know who you can trust on the rebel side, and a lot of criminal groups have just started calling themselves FSA brigades or jihadi brigades, so you never know who you're dealing with. Add to that the fact that the dominant military force now in many areas, and certainly in the north of Syria, are the jihadi groups who have explicitly said they wish to arrest journalists. Several friends of mine are in captivity now, accused of being spies on no evidence at all, and in captivity with no end in sight. That is why I think no reputable news organisations are deploying into Syria at the moment on the opposition side.
OK, Lucie, let me come to you now, because the story that we've just heard from Paul is harrowing in the extreme, but also the kidnappings, the other aspects of this as well, where kind of you almost sense that state actors are involved as well.
No, absolutely. I mean, the findings of this 2013 review are absolutely interesting regarding this number of kidnappings that has doubled, more than doubled since last year. We had 38 journalists kidnapped in 2012, and this year in 2013 they were 87. So that's quite an increase. They are being, of course, targeted by different groups, by also state actors, non-state actors. It's very difficult for journalists to be able to see where the danger comes from, and I think that's one of the point that was just made. Syria is probably one of the most difficult country to cover. Among the 87 journalists who were abducted, 49 were abducted in Syria, the rest in Libya, and also in the rest of sub-Saharan Africa.
So go through some of the other countries as well, if you would, where life is particularly tough for journalists trying to report to the world what is happening.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, we see a slight fall in the number of journalists killed. 71 this year. It was 88 last year, the worst record since we started compiling these numbers in 1995. So you see a slight fall, but at the same time, the threats against journalists and the physical attacks have risen of over 9% this year. So it's still difficult to be able to report the news in countries like Syria, obviously, but also Somalia, in a country like obviously the Philippines, and also in the list this year, we've added instead of Brazil and Mexico, we've also added India, which is a country that we would not expect to see in the list. You can see countries where you have situation of conflicts, and other countries where it's just different groups, organized crime, private militias, state actors, but also some
okay, Lucy,
corrupt politicians who are going to target journalists.
Thank you. Let me just come back to Paul with a final thought, briefly, if you would. And of course, you know, if you're not in Syria, you're not able to tell the world firsthand that, forget the journalists, the suffering of the people there on an epic scale.
Well, what we're seeing now is a lack of independent witnesses, and we're relying much more on citizen journalists, but they are subject to the same or more extreme pressures as foreign journalists. There isn't perhaps the financial incentive, but there's the ideological incentive to kidnap local journalists. A friend of mine was in an ISIS or an Al-Qaeda jail, hung by his arms for 3 weeks. What was his crime? It was making unauthorized statements about ISIS, i.e. reporting on ISIS in Syria, and that's what they're facing.
Paul, thank you very much. Global will be back shortly.